So, it's that time of the year again, 20 games left in the regular season, and it's time for the NBA community to do their favorite pastime. Get in front of a camera, microphone, or grab your cell phone, hop on Twitter, and argue religiously about who should win the MVP this year. The amount of insults and fake stats that are thrown around this time of the season, oh man, it just fills me up with joy, and this year is no different. Giannis, Jokic, and Embiid have found themselves as the top 3 candidates in the race, and honestly, all 3 of them have really good arguments. All 3 of those players are having historically great seasons from a production standpoint while being on some of the best teams in the NBA, so their value is pretty undeniable. However, everyone doesn't feel this way, especially when it comes to Nikola Jokic.
When it comes down to guys winning MVP since 1990, it's only 3 guys that won the MVP that wasn't top 10 in scoring.
No. I refuse to talk about that Kendrick Perkins take on this channel, but I did so on my second, so make sure you go check that out, link in the description. Nevertheless, when it comes to Jokic in a vacuum, someone who's averaging a 24-point triple-double while having a historically great offensive season, while also being on the #1 seed in the Western Conference, is normally a no-brainer. But what makes this controversial is when you open up the lens and realize that Jokic will be winning his 3rd MVP in the row, making him the first player to accomplish this since Larry Bird in the mid-80s. Which certainly is going to raise some eyebrows. How is it that someone like Jokic is able to pull this off when other all-time greats such as LeBron James and Michael Jordan were not able to? Especially when there is a growing belief throughout NBA history that players had not been able to accomplish said feat due to voter fatigue or lack of playoff success that seems to not be applicable to Jokic this year. And of course, when there's this amount of dialogue and conversation around the MVP, there's a bunch of other talking points that have to be addressed as well. So with that being said, let's tackle this head on. What does it mean to be the most valuable player in the league, the inconsistency in goalposts moving potentially from certain voters, and more importantly, should Jokic win the MVP over Embiid and Giannis? But before we get into the video, there are 3 things that I have to highlight. A, the NBA media has not always been the one who has selected the MVP. Before 1981, the players had the responsibility of determining who was going to be deemed the most valuable player on a year-to-year basis. Now, in theory, this sounds great. Who knows better than the actual players themselves on who's the most valuable player in the league? However, when you actually go back to see who was winning the award on a year-to-year basis, well, let's just say there was a lot of goalposts moving back in the day. B, and I can't believe I have to say this, the MVP is voted on before the playoffs begin. The amount of times I've been on my timeline and I have seen people make arguments about the MVP correlating to what happened in that year's playoff run is mind-blowing to me. No one's going to know how poorly someone's going to perform in the playoffs or how deep someone is going to go in the playoffs if the playoffs have not yet started. And finally, just because you have more voters believing that you should win the award does not necessarily mean you will receive the MVP trophy. When it comes to the voting process, the voters have the responsibility to select 5 candidates, and then of those 5 candidates, they have to rank them amongst one another. And then after they rank them, and depending on where you are placed, will determine how many MVP points you will receive. And once it's all said and done, league officials gather up all the ballots, tally all the points together, and whoever has the most MVP points will be deemed the MVP. Yeah, I know this all sounds very complicated, but trust me, later on in the video, this information will be very important. Now, with that out of the way, we can address the elephant in the room, and that is, what does it mean to be the most valuable player in the NBA? This has been an ongoing conversation for several years now, so what I decided to do was take some talking points and see if there's any correlation amongst the players who receive the MVP on a year-to-year basis. First, does the MVP belong to the best player in the league? I want to get this one out the way as quick as possible because it's very easy to debunk, and the answer is obviously no. I hate when people use this talking point in these conversations because it's so obvious that the MVP is not the best player in the league award because we have a near endless examples proving otherwise. Westbrook, Rose, Dirk, Iverson, Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, Dave Cowens, just to name a few, are great examples of players receiving the awards when they were not viewed as the best player in said year. How about having two-way impacts and statistical standards that have been set in place to determine who should be named MVP? This essentially is an argument that Perkins and many other people that I see make against Jokic, questioning his value due to his defensive limitations, and even going as far as to question Dirk and Nash. Now, to an extent, there is some truth behind this. There has to be a level of statistical excellence that one needs to meet to really display their value in this conversation. And when it comes to defensive impact, that can without a doubt sway voters in one direction rather than the other. However, the problem with these arguments is that it focuses on what a player lacks rather than the actual value that they provide. When making the case for Jokic, of course it's going to be more offensive leaning because that's what makes him valuable. And the same concept goes for players such as Nash and Magic. Questioning their scoring impact is pointless because we all know their value is primarily based on what they do from a passing and playmaking standpoint. And because of that, it's the reason why I really don't like this argument, because the people who use it are doing it in bad faith. Or what about the take X player off of X team argument that many people rely on? The premise of this argument is to outline how valuable a candidate can be due to the dependency of his teammates due to their lack of talent. And I have to be honest, there is some validity to this argument. Not only because there are voters who openly stated that they use this logic when they cast their ballot, but also having a teammate that is too talented could certainly hurt one's case. The best example of this is in 1972, where Jerry West finished second in the MVP race despite the fact that he was on a 69-win ball club, but that's because the voters had a hard time differentiating who was more valuable for the Lakers, Jerry West or Wilt Chamberlain. And because of that, they split votes amongst one another, which allowed Kareem to be named MVP. But even with that valid information, there's still way more recipients that would point in another direction. Not only because there are several MVP recipients who were playing alongside very talented teammates, such as LeBron in Miami when he was playing alongside Wade and Bosh, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, and Dennis Johnson were Larry Bird's teammates when he won 3 in a row. Magic Johnson and Kareem played alongside one another when they won their MVPs, as well as sharing the floor with really talented teammates like James Worthy, Norm Nixon, and Jamal Wilkes. But by far the best example that really puts this ideology into question is Moses Malone in 1983 winning the MVP after joining a Sixers team that was so talented that in a year before, they were in the NBA Finals. But the biggest reason why it's really hard to rely on this ideology is because it's all based in hypotheticals. And with the hypothetical nature of this ideology, quickly you can find yourself on a very slippery slope. Because technically speaking, if you took Michael Jordan off the Chicago Bulls, they were still a great defensive unit that won 55 games and made the playoffs. So are you then going to question the validity behind MJ's MVPs? Yeah, I highly doubt it. So if none of those have been the true standard to determine who is the most valuable player, then what has been? Well, after doing some extensive research, there are only 2 consistent factors dating all the way back to 1956 to determine who should win the MVP. The first one is games played. Every player to receive an MVP has played at bare minimum 85% of the games that were available to them during their year that they won the award. Except for 1978, where Bill Walton won the MVP after only playing 58 games. Hey, maybe Kendrick Perkins is on to something, but outside of Bill Walton, everyone else has played at bare minimum 85%, which during a normal 82-game regular season is 70 games. And the second consistent factor that voters have been voting on has been winning. Like it or not, the team record of a candidate means a lot. Out of the 68 times the NBA has handed out the MVP award, 62 of the recipients have been on top 3 records in their respective conferences. That's over 90% of the time. For an even better example of how important winning has been for voters over the years, let's go back to the 1990 MVP race, where despite the fact that Barkley had great numbers across the board, led a lesser team to one of the top 3 seeds in his conference, and even had more first place votes, he still lost the race to Magic Johnson. Now, unfortunately, there isn't any concrete evidence that points us to the direction to why this occurred. However, one could easily come to a conclusion that even though Barkley might have had more first place votes, there were even more voters willing to vote Barkley outside of your top 2 candidates because of the Sixers' record in contrast to the Bulls and Lakers. So yes, it's undeniable, winning does matter. But I have to admit, in recent history, that's certainly changed. Now, why do I say that? Well, let's look at the exceptions to the rules, the players who won the MVP but were not top 3 seeds in their conferences. Bob Pettit in 56, Kareem in 76, Moses Malone in 79, then again in 82, but then after that, it took over 30 years for the voters to select someone who was not a top 3 seed in Russell Westbrook, and did it again a few years later in Nikola Jokic. And it doesn't stop there. Last season, the Phoenix Suns not only won a franchise best, but also a league high 64 games, while Devin Booker was named first team All-NBA as he averaged 27 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, as well as a steal, but received 0 first place votes in the MVP race, which is the first time that has ever happened for a player who made the first team All-NBA to be on a 60-win ball club and not even be considered to win the MVP. And honestly, the voters got it right. Even though, yes, what we have seen in recent history has been inconsistent to what the traditional ideology is for an MVP, I honestly believe that this has been the most accurate representation of MVP recipients in NBA history. And quite honestly, all of this makes sense when you put things into its proper context. Back in the day with media members and players, when they were voting on who should be the MVP, they had very little information to their disposal. At best, you would turn on ESPN and view a couple of highlights, see the numbers, and then before that, you would have to open up a newspaper and actually look at the stat line and figure out who won the game or not. So it makes sense for that era of voters to be heavily dependent on winning bias and just simple points, rebounds, and assists metrics. But in today's world, that's much more different. In the age of information, where games are more accessible than they have ever been, there's much more open dialogue in terms of the concept of what it means to be valuable in the MVP race. And as much as people may not like it, we have way more information at our fingertips that give us much more accurate depictions on what the concept of valuable actually means. So instead of us using silly hypotheticals about taking X player off of X team, we can just look at what the team's record is when that player is not available and look at how well they produce when he's on the floor versus when he's off. Instead of us being overly dependent on blocks per game, we can actually see what opposing teams shoot from the field when a certain player is protecting the basket. And instead of us using field goal percentage, we actually have other metrics such as true shooting percentage and effective field goal percentage to determine how impactful and efficient of a score someone is. And because of this new information, I do believe it gives us a more accurate representation of what it means to be the most valuable player. Now, of course, traditionalists don't want to hear this, and many of them would argue that Jokic shouldn't win his 3rd in a row because it didn't happen to LeBron or Jordan, or Jokic should not have won it last season as a 6th seed because it wasn't given to Kobe in 2006. To those people, I would respond in the most respectful way I possibly can, and that is, stop being dumb. To argue that we should succumb to bad decision making and mistakes because the people before us fell victim to them is irrational. And due to that unjarring truth to many people, it's the reason why we have new precedents being set. It's the reason why in the 2015 finals, even though the Cavaliers lost, LeBron still received very strong consideration to be deemed finals MVP. It's the reason why a year later, Curry became the first unanimous MVP. It's the reason why a year after that, Westbrook won the MVP while being a 6th seed. It's the reason why 2 years ago, Jokic won the award while also being a 6th seed. And it's also the reason why in that same year, Curry finished 3rd in the MVP race despite the fact that the Warriors didn't even make the playoffs. And with all of that being said, I now answer the question that I know people want me to answer, and that is, who is my MVP? And my response is, bro, we still have 15 games left. Like I stated in the beginning of this video, Jokic, Giannis, and Embiid all have very quality arguments to be made. So much so that I believe that the race is extremely close. But if you must know, I have Jokic number 1, Giannis 2nd, and Embiid 3rd. And Giannis is certainly making a great argument as of late to overtake Jokic for the MVP. But again, we got like 15 more games, so calm down. But hey, those are just my thoughts. If you ever wonder why I'm not uploading on this channel, I'm probably doing other things. I have a second channel, go check that out, link in the description. I also stream on a platform called playback.tv, link in the description if you ever want to catch me watching basketball games live. And if that's too much to keep up with, just follow me on Twitter, I'll update you there. But as always, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thumbs up button if you enjoyed the video, and hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you can be updated when I upload on this channel. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.